There is a place on this earth where the sun vanishes for months at a time, where the sea itself turns to stone, where the air can freeze the moisture in your lungs before you finish exhaling, and where the horizon plays tricks so convincing that men have sailed toward mirages of warm, open water and found nothing waiting for them but ice, silence, and death. That place is the Arctic, and for as long as human beings have known it existed, they have been unable to leave it alone. This is not a story about cold, or rather it is, but cold is only the surface of it. Beneath the ice, beneath the centuries of expeditions and disasters and obsessions and cover-ups, there is something far older and far stranger, the human compulsion to walk toward the thing that frightens us most. The Arctic has always been that thing. It has always sat at the edge of the known world, radiating mystery, promising something, riches, glory, passage to another hemisphere, perhaps even the secret mechanism of the universe itself, and it has punished, almost without exception, every single person who came to collect. And yet they kept coming. They kept coming for over 1,000 years. To understand why, you have to understand what the Arctic meant to people who had never seen it. In the ancient world, the far north was not merely a geographical location. It was a theological one. The Greeks called it Hyperborea, the land beyond the north wind, and they believed it was inhabited by a perfect race of beings who lived in eternal sunshine, untouched by age or sorrow. Pindar wrote about it. Herodotus puzzled over it. The idea was so persistent and so intoxicating that it worked its way into the cultural DNA of half the civilizations that bordered the northern hemisphere, each one adding its own details, its own mythological furniture, its own particular flavour of longing. The Norse, who actually lived close enough to the Arctic to occasionally brush against its reality, had a more nuanced relationship with it. For them, the frozen north was the home of the frost giants, the Jotnar, vast and terrible beings whose existence predated the gods themselves. The northernmost reaches of the world were where order ended and chaos began, where the rules that governed human life dissolved into something primordial and dangerous. And yet the Norse went there anyway. They went because the sea was their highway, and the horizon was their inheritance, and because standing at the edge of the unknown and staring into it was for a Viking not madness, but something close to a moral obligation. The Irish monks who followed in their wake had their own reasons. For men like St. Brendan, who according to tradition sailed into the northern Atlantic in the 6th century in nothing more substantial than a curragh, a small boat made of ox hides stretched over a wooden frame. The frozen waters beyond the known world were a place of spiritual testing, a wilderness as profound and as purifying as any desert. The stories they brought back were extraordinary. Islands that turned out to be sleeping whales, pillars of crystal rising from the sea, a land of fire beyond the fog. Whether these were allegories, hallucinations, or genuine descriptions of Icelandic volcanoes and icebergs, seen for the first time by European eyes, we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that those stories circulated for centuries, growing richer and stranger with every retelling, and that they pulled generation after generation of explorers northward toward the ice. But mythology and religion were only part of what drove men into the Arctic. There was also, from very early on, the question of commerce. The northern seas were full of extraordinary things that the rest of the world wanted desperately. Walrus ivory, which before the opening of the African elephant trade was the primary source of carved ivory in Europe, sealskin and polar bear furs, whalebone used for everything, from corset stays to umbrella ribs, and above all, fish, vast, almost incomprehensible quantities of cod and herring that fed the populations of Catholic Europe through their endless Fridays of obligatory abstinence. The men who fished the northern waters understood perfectly well that they were operating in conditions that could kill them without warning, and they went anyway, year after year, generation after generation, because the alternative was poverty. It was this economic imperative, this cold, practical hunger, that first sent large numbers of European sailors into genuinely Arctic waters and produced the first real body of knowledge about what the far north was actually like. The Basque whalers of the 16th century, who hunted bowhead whales in the waters of Labrador and Hudson Strait, and kept their operations so secret that scholars didn't fully piece together the scale of their enterprise until the late 20th century, were operating in conditions that would have seemed extraordinary to any landlubber. They were rendering whale blubber on beaches surrounded by icebergs, navigating waters where pack ice could close in with astonishing speed, and wintering in some cases in conditions so harsh that several of their ships and many of their men simply never came home. They left almost no written records. That was deliberate. The fishing grounds were commercially valuable, and the Basques had no interest in sharing what they knew with their competitors. But they left something else, a silence that would echo down through the centuries of Arctic exploration that followed, a silence that said, quietly and unmistakably, that the people who really knew the Arctic understood that it was not a place you talked about carelessly. It was a place you respected, and respecting it meant acknowledging how little you actually understood it. This distinction between the people who knew the Arctic through lived experience and the people who imagined it from comfortable libraries is crucial to everything that follows. Because the great disasters of Arctic exploration, the ones that killed hundreds of men and sent dozens of expeditions spinning off into chaos and tragedy, were almost always produced by the collision between imagination and reality. Between the Arctic that men had constructed in their minds, navigable, comprehensible, ultimately yielding, and the Arctic that actually existed, which was none of those things. The Inuit had been living in this reality for approximately 4,000 years by the time European explorers began arriving in numbers. They had developed technologies and knowledge systems of extraordinary sophistication precisely because the environment demanded nothing less. Their knowledge of ice, its different textures and colours and sounds, the way it moved and shifted and changed with the seasons and the tides, was so intricate and so specific that the European explorers who occasionally encountered them and bothered to pay attention were astonished. The Inuit built boats that were so perfectly adapted to Arctic conditions that no European design has ever fully equalled them. They developed clothing that could keep a human being alive in temperatures that would kill an unprepared man in minutes. They understood the Arctic not as an adversary to be conquered, but as a place that could be lived in, if you were humble enough to learn its rules. The tragedy that runs through the entire history of European Arctic exploration is that this knowledge was available, right there, waiting to be asked for, and it was almost never systematically sought. The reasons for this were complex and ugly. Racism obviously played a large role, as did the particular brand of cultural arrogance that led 19th century British naval officers to believe that the methodologies that had served them in temperate climates would transfer seamlessly to the polar regions. But there was also something deeper, something harder to name. A sense, perhaps, that accepting help from people the explorers considered primitive would somehow diminish the achievement of whatever it was they were trying to accomplish. As if the whole point was not to arrive safely, but to arrive heroically, which required at some level that the journey be unnecessarily difficult. This peculiar logic produced results that were, in retrospect, almost surreally self-defeating. British naval expeditions to the Arctic in the 19th century routinely carried silver cutlery and glass decanters and libraries of improving literature, while failing to equip themselves with the kind of clothing and diet and travel techniques that would have dramatically improved their chances of survival. They sledged enormous wooden boats across the ice when they could have built or bought kayaks. They ate tinned food when they could have hunted and fished. They died of scurvy while indigenous populations around them lived in robust health. It was not ignorance that killed them, or not entirely. It was a particular kind of knowing better, a conviction that civilization, properly applied, was sufficient armour against the hostility of the natural world. The Arctic, as it always does, disagreed. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we reach the great catastrophes of the 19th century, before we follow the Franklin expedition into the ice and watch it disappear, before we track the Greely expedition into madness and cannibalism, before we discover what the Soviet Union was doing on the polar ice in the middle of the 20th century, before all of that, we need to follow the first Europeans who pushed north into genuinely unknown waters, the people who established the template of obsession and disaster that everyone who came after would, consciously or not, be following. We need to go to the Norse. In the year 982, a man named Erik Thorvaldsson sailed west from Iceland, into waters that no European, at least no European whose name we know, had ever crossed. And he did it because he had been exiled for manslaughter and had nowhere else to go. Erik the Red, as he was known, was not by any reasonable measure a sympathetic character. He was violent, quarrelsome, and possessed of a temper that had already gotten him expelled from Norway before he ended up in Iceland, and which had now gotten him expelled from Iceland as well, the Icelandic Althing, the world's oldest surviving parliament, had given him 3 years of outlawry, which meant that for 3 years he had no legal protection whatsoever, and that any man who killed him would face no legal consequences. Under those circumstances, there was really only one reasonable option: go somewhere that the laws of the Althing couldn't reach. He had heard stories about land to the west. The stories were vague and second-hand. A sailor named Gunnbjörn had been blown off course decades earlier, and reported glimpsing some coastline through the fog, but they were enough. Eric loaded a ship with his household and his livestock, and what remained of his portable wealth, and sailed west into the unknown, and what he found, after weeks of sailing through waters that were frequently choked with drift ice, was an enormous island, the largest island in the world, though he couldn't have known that, whose eastern coast was a forbidding rampart of glaciers and rock that offered nothing in the way of welcome. He kept sailing. He went south around the bottom of the island and north again along the western coast, and there he found something that genuinely surprised him. A landscape that, in summer at least, bore a real resemblance to the fjord country of western Norway. There were sheltered inlets and green valleys and freshwater streams and, most importantly, no other people competing for the resources. Eric spent 3 years exploring and naming things after himself, the habit of the age, and when his exile was up he sailed back to Iceland with a proposal. He called the island Greenland. This was not, as has sometimes been suggested, a piece of deliberate misdirection designed to lure unsuspecting settlers to a frozen wasteland. The name made a certain sense for the specific areas along the southwestern coast where Eric had found his fjords and valleys, but it was also unmistakably marketing, and it worked. When Eric returned to Greenland in 985 or 986, he brought with him 25 ships loaded with settlers, livestock and everything necessary to establish permanent colonies on the edge of the Arctic world. Only 14 of those ships completed the crossing. The rest were driven back by storms or simply lost. The people on those 14 ships established what became known as the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement, names that reflect their position relative to each other on the southwestern coast of Greenland, not their position relative to Iceland. At their height, these settlements supported somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 people, with farms, churches, a bishop's seat, and enough surplus production to pay tribute to the Norwegian crown in the form of walrus ivory, live polar bears, and furs. For nearly 500 years they were the westernmost permanent European presence in the world. Eric's son Leif is the one who pushed the frontier further. Around the year 1000, following directions he had obtained from a man named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who'd been blown off course and sighted land further to the west without bothering to investigate it, a failure of curiosity that Leif apparently found inexplicable. Leif organised an expedition and sailed southwest from Greenland. He found, in sequence, a land of flat stones, probably Baffin Island, a land of forests, probably Labrador, and a land he called Vinland, which he reached by sailing south and which offered grapes, or possibly gooseberries. The botanical identification is contested, and timber, and a climate mild enough to winter in without undue hardship. The Norse word Vinland has generated an enormous amount of scholarly argument and popular speculation over the centuries. For a long time, no one was quite sure whether it referred to an actual place, or was a literary construction, a mythological land of plenty invented to make the saga narratives more dramatic. Then, in 1960, a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife Anne Steen Ingstad found something in a meadow at the northernmost tip of Newfoundland that settled the question definitively. The remains of 8 turf-built structures, built in a distinctly Norse style containing a spindle whorl, iron boat rivets, a bronze pin of Norse design, and the residue of a smithing hearth, the oldest known iron-working site in the New World. Lonso Meadows, as the site is called, was occupied for only a few decades before the Norse abandoned it, probably because of conflicts with the indigenous people they called Skraelings, but it proved beyond any reasonable doubt that Europeans had reached North America 5 centuries before Columbus. What the sagas don't tell you, what they couldn't have known, is that the Norse presence in the Arctic was far more extensive and far more deeply embedded in the landscape than the story of the Vinland voyages suggests. Archaeological work in Greenland and the Canadian Arctic has revealed Norse artifacts and Norse-influenced objects scattered across thousands of miles of coastline at sites far beyond any known settlement. There are Norse wool yarns in Inuit middens. There are Inuit carvings that appear to represent Norse people. bearded figures in hooded robes, unlike anything in the indigenous artistic tradition. There are iron artifacts at sites where no Norse settlement is recorded, suggesting trade networks or exploration routes that the written sources don't mention. The Norse and the Inuit knew each other, in other words, over a very wide area and for a very long time. The nature of that relationship varied, sometimes peaceful exchange, sometimes violent conflict, but it was a relationship, and it was conducted across some of the most challenging terrain on Earth by people who had, on both sides, developed extraordinary competence for operating in those conditions. Then, starting in the 14th century, the Norse Greenland settlements began to fail. The reasons are still debated. Climate cooling during the Little Ice Age, overgrazing and soil erosion, increasing difficulty of the sea route from Europe as ice conditions worsened. The Black Death, reducing both the population in Europe that might have supported the colonies and the crews available to make the supply voyages, but the result is not in doubt. The western settlement was apparently abandoned around 1350. An Icelandic bishop who visited the eastern settlement in the year 1341 found it still functioning. By 1408, the last written record from Greenland mentions a wedding in the church at Volsey. After that, silence. The fate of the Greenland Norse was one of the great mysteries of the medieval world, and it generated theories and speculation for centuries. Some writers suggested they had been killed by the Inuit. Others proposed they had interbred with the indigenous population and lost their separate identity. Others believed they had simply migrated further into the continent, that somewhere in the interior of North America there were communities of descendants of these lost Norse colonists, maintaining, against all odds, some fragment of their European heritage. None of these theories has been confirmed. The most likely explanation, supported by the archaeology of the final decades of the Eastern settlement, is that the remaining population gradually declined and died out. Not dramatically, not through massacre, but slowly, worn down by cold and hunger and isolation, with no one coming to help and no way out. The Norse failure in Greenland established a template that would be repeated, with variations many times over the following centuries. The confident assumption that a human settlement could be sustained in the Arctic through willpower and the application of European techniques, the gradual, grinding discovery that the Arctic had its own rules, and the final, quiet capitulation to an environment that simply exceeded what the people involved were prepared to cope with. It was a lesson that needed to be learned over and over again, because it was a lesson that ran contrary to every instinct of the cultures doing the learning. Giving up was not what explorers did. Admitting defeat was not what empires did. And so each generation rediscovered the Arctic's capacity for destruction and paid for that discovery in lives. Here is an idea that killed hundreds of people over the course of about 3 centuries, an idea so appealing and so wrong that it refused to die even after repeated direct contact with the evidence of its falseness, the open polar sea. The theory in its basic form was this: the sun shines continuously in the Arctic during the summer months, which means that the polar regions receive more solar energy per day during summer than anywhere else on Earth. This solar energy must, logically, melt the ice. Therefore, at the very centre of the Arctic, directly at the North Pole, there must be an ice-free ocean, warm, navigable, perhaps even pleasant, surrounded by an outer ring of pack ice that merely needed to be crossed to reach it. Once you were through the ice, you were in the clear. Once you were in the clear, you could sail straight across the top of the world to Asia. The appeal of this theory to the mercantile powers of early modern Europe is easy to understand. The sea routes to Asia around Africa and South America were long, dangerous, and controlled by Spain and Portugal under the terms of the Treaty of Tordesillas. A route across the top of the world would be shorter, potentially safer, and open to anyone willing to brave the initial ring of ice. The English, who had been effectively shut out of the southern routes by Iberian monopolies, were particularly interested in the northern option, and in the second half of the 16th century they began sending expeditions to find it. Martin Frobisher made 3 voyages between 1576 and 1578, probing the waters of the Canadian Arctic and becoming convinced at various points that he had found the Northwest Passage, that he had found the Northeast Passage, and that he had found enormous quantities of gold ore, a belief that prompted the shipping of 200 tons of worthless black rock back to England before the metallurgical truth was established. Frobisher was not a stupid man, but he was an impatient one, and the Arctic, which rewards only patience, treated him accordingly. John Davis followed, Frobisher in the 1580s, reaching further north and doing more careful work, producing charts that remained useful for a century and a half. Henry Hudson pushed deeper still in 1607, sailing north of Spitzbergen to a latitude of 80 degrees 23 minutes north, before he was turned back by ice that he noted in his journal with "what sounds," reading between the lines like genuine bewilderment, as if the ice had no business being there. Hudson was looking for the open polar sea. The ice's refusal to provide one did not shake his belief in it. He simply concluded that he hadn't gone far enough, or that he had come at the wrong time of year, or that the passage was somewhere slightly different from where he had looked. This flexibility of interpretation, this infinite capacity to relocate the hoped-for discovery to just beyond the latest point of failure, was characteristic of virtually every northern explorer of the period, and it is one of the most psychologically fascinating aspects of the whole enterprise. In 1616, Robert Bylot and William Baffin sailed up the western coast of Greenland and into the broad waters of the bay that now bears Baffin's name, reaching a latitude of 77 degrees 45 minutes north, a record that would not be beaten for more than 200 years. They found no open polar sea, they found no northwest passage. What they did find was a large, mostly enclosed body of water surrounded by ice and land, with 3 inlets on its western side: Lancaster Sound, Jones Sound, and Smith Sound, any one of which they correctly noted might lead somewhere interesting. Then they went home and wrote a report that was so negative about the prospects for Arctic navigation that their discoveries were effectively removed from subsequent maps and forgotten about for the better part of 2 centuries. The idea of the Northwest Passage, the belief that there was a navigable sea route through the Canadian Arctic from the Atlantic to the Pacific, survived all of this, and more. It survived because it was commercially important enough that people wanted it to be true, and when people want something to be true badly enough, they are remarkably creative in finding reasons why the latest evidence against it doesn't actually settle the question. The passage must exist. It just hadn't been found yet. More expeditions were needed. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the far north that would eventually transform the entire enterprise of Arctic exploration, though not in any way that the explorers themselves would have chosen. The discovery in the early 17th century that the waters around Spitzbergen, the archipelago midway between Norway and the North Pole, contained bowhead whales in extraordinary numbers launched a commercial frenzy that, within a few decades, had established permanent seasonal stations on the Spitzbergen coast and sent hundreds of ships a year into waters that had previously been visited only by a handful of explorers. The whalers were not exploring in any formal sense. They were working. But the knowledge they accumulated about ice conditions, about weather patterns, about the behaviour of the sea in different seasons, about which routes were open and which were not, was of inestimable value to anyone trying to understand the Arctic. And some of that knowledge filtered back into the mainstream, influencing subsequent expeditions. But only some of it, and only imperfectly, because the relationship between the professional explorers and the commercial sailors was never easy. The explorers were gentlemen and naval officers, the whalers were tradesmen. The knowledge of tradesmen was considered, by the standards of the age, somewhat lower grade than proper scientific observation, and was therefore somewhat discounted. This class-based dismissal of practical expertise was, again, not unusual for the period, but it had consequences in the Arctic that were more immediately lethal than it did elsewhere. The whalers knew which routes through the ice were relatively reliable, and which were death traps. They knew how fast conditions could change and what the warning signs looked like. They knew, from hard experience, what kinds of provisions and equipment gave you the best chance of surviving an unexpected winter in the ice. None of this knowledge was secret exactly. It existed in the form of accumulated practical wisdom, the kind of thing that gets passed down from master to apprentice, and eventually becomes so embedded in professional culture that it's no longer explicitly taught because everyone simply knows it. But it was not the kind of knowledge that got written down in reports to the Admiralty, and it was not the kind of knowledge that the Admiralty was in the habit of seeking. The gap between what was known and what was acted upon reached its most catastrophic expression in the middle of the 19th century in the form of the most famous and most terrible of all Arctic expeditions, the one that sent Sir John Franklin and 128 men into the Canadian Arctic in the summer of 1845 and swallowed them all without a trace. The ships were magnificent. The Erebus and the Terror were both Royal Navy bomb vessels, a class of ship built to withstand the enormous recoil forces generated by the heavy mortars that were their original armament, which meant they were, by the standards of the day, extraordinarily robust and well constructed. Both had been reinforced further for polar service, with iron-plated bows and steam engines driving screw propellers that could be retracted into the hull when not in use. They carried enough provisions, tinned food, preserved meats, barrels of flour and biscuit and cocoa, to sustain the combined crew of 129 men for 3 years. They carried a library of nearly 3,000 volumes. They carried a hand organ capable of playing 50 tunes. They carried cut glass and silver plate and mahogany furniture, and all the accoutrements of Victorian naval civilization, which was, in the mid-19th century, the most advanced and well-organized military force on Earth. John Franklin was 60 years old when he took command of this expedition, and he was already famous. Famous enough that the artist who painted his portrait showed him in full naval uniform, chest covered in medals, with an expression of calm and competence that was entirely appropriate for a man who had survived 2 previous Arctic expeditions, one of which had become famous throughout England as the catastrophe in which the men had been reduced to eating their own leather boots, and several of them had been murdered for their flesh by a deranged voyageur. The boot-eating episode had given Franklin a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life: the man who ate his boots. He was not troubled by it. He wore it, in a way, as a badge of honour. Proof that he had faced the worst the Arctic could offer and had survived. He should not have been given the command of the 1845 expedition. His age alone was a disqualifying factor, or should have been. Commanding officers of polar expeditions needed to be capable of extreme physical exertion under terrible conditions, and a 60-year-old man, however distinguished, was not going to be able to haul sledges across the ice. The original choice for the command had been James Clark Ross, who had more Arctic experience than anyone else available, and who was, at 45, a much more suitable age. But Ross was newly married, and his wife had extracted a promise from him that he would not take another polar voyage, so he declined, and the position was offered down the list until it reached Franklin, who accepted it with something that all accounts describe as genuine enthusiasm. There was also the matter of the second-in-command. Francis Crozier, who commanded the Terror, was in many ways better qualified for the expedition than Franklin, more experienced in polar navigation, harder and more practical in temperament, less invested in the mythologies of British naval invincibility. But Crozier was Irish and Catholic in a service that was English and Protestant, and his career had been obstructed at every turn by the casual prejudices of the institution he served. He had asked Jane Franklin, the expedition commander's wife, to marry him before her marriage to John, and had been refused. There was between Crozier and the world around him a kind of muffled frustration, a sense of abilities and insights not fully used, that would become, in the Arctic, something very much like prophecy. The expedition sailed from the Thames on the 19th of May, 1845, to tremendous public enthusiasm. They stopped in Greenland to take on additional supplies and to leave behind 5 men who had been deemed unfit for service. The last European to see them was a Scottish whaling captain named Robert Martin, who encountered the Erebus and the Terror moored to an iceberg in Lancaster Sound in late July, waiting for ice conditions to improve before proceeding west. The men were in good health and good spirits. Franklin told Martin they had enough provisions for 5 to 7 years. Then the ice shifted, and the ships moved, and they were gone. For 2 years, no one was particularly worried. Arctic expeditions routinely lost contact with the outside world for extended periods. The whole point, after all, was to go somewhere that ships didn't normally go, and there was no expectation of regular communication. By the spring of 1847, when the ships should, if all had gone well, have been on their way back or already back, there was still nothing. No message, no ship, no word of any kind. The silence was absolute. What had happened, we now know, or know in substantial outline from the evidence accumulated over a century and a half of searches, both historical and archaeological, is this. In the summer of 1845, Franklin sailed west through Lancaster Sound and north up Wellington Channel before turning back south, apparently looking for a western passage. He wintered in 1845 to 46 at a place called Beechy Island at the entrance to Wellington Channel. 3 men died during that winter and were buried on the island. Their graves, discovered years later, would become the first physical evidence found of the expedition's fate. The bodies of those 3 men preserved in the permafrost were exhumed in the 1980s and found to contain alarming concentrations of lead, suggesting either lead poisoning from the soldered seams of the expedition's tinned food, a hypothesis that has been controversial, or lead from the ship's water system, or both. In the summer of 1846, the ships moved south and west, navigating through the maze of islands in the central Canadian Arctic, and were beset, trapped by ice. Sometime in September 1846 in Victoria Strait, just north of King William Island. They never moved again. Franklin died on the 11th of June, 1847, under circumstances that remain unclear. He had been in declining health, and the cause of his death might have been almost anything: pneumonia, tuberculosis, or some complication of the lead poisoning that was apparently affecting the entire crew. He was 61 years old, and he had been frozen in the ice for nearly a year. Command passed to Francis Crozier. What Crozier faced was almost unimaginable. The ships had now been locked in the ice for 2 winters. 24 officers and men had died in addition to Franklin. The surviving 105 men were, by the spring of 1848, in bad enough condition that Crozier made the decision to abandon the ships and march south across King William Island toward the Back River, the only route he knew of that might lead, eventually, to civilization. On the 25th of April, 1848, the last message ever recorded from the Franklin expedition was placed in a cairn on King William Island. It was a standard Royal Navy form, filled out twice, once in 1847 when all was still well, and once in 1848 when things were very much not. The 1848 addendum, written around the margins of the original message in cramped handwriting, noted the death of Franklin, the loss of 24 men, and the intention to march south. The handwriting has been analysed many times. It is described as hurried and somewhat uncertain, the handwriting of men who were not well. None of those 105 men survived. They died across the tundra of King William Island and the mainland coast, some in groups, some apparently alone, over a period that stretched, according to Inuit oral traditions, for perhaps 2 or 3 years after the abandonment of the ships. The Inuit testimony, collected by the explorer Charles Francis Hall in the 1860s, described men who were thin and sick and unable to communicate effectively, men whose bodies were found by Inuit hunters in their tents and beside their boats, men who had apparently fallen and not been able to get up. It described, in one account that has haunted everyone who's read it, a boat on the beach with a large number of dead men in it, and near the boat a tent, and in the tent more dead men, and all around the scene the evidence of a desperate but failed attempt to drag the boat over the ice towards safety. The question that has obsessed historians ever since the 19th century is, why didn't more of them survive? 105 men, many of them experienced sailors, with boats and provisions and at least some navigational knowledge. Why didn't any of them reach safety? The answers that have been proposed over the years form a catalogue of everything that can go wrong in the Arctic: lead poisoning impairing mental function and physical coordination, scurvy weakening the men who were not poisoned, the sheer distance to any inhabited place, the weight of the equipment they were dragging, which included, according to evidence found on King William Island, silver plate, mahogany writing desks and a library, things that served no survival purpose but that the men apparently could not bring themselves to leave behind, as if maintaining the forms of civilization in the face of the Arctic was to the end more important than making it home. There is something else in the testimony, something that the Victorian public found profoundly disturbing, and that the official searchers spent considerable energy trying to suppress, and that is evidence of cannibalism. The cut marks on the bones found on King William Island, analysed in the 20th century with forensic techniques, are unmistakably the marks of deliberate defleshing, the same marks made by the same techniques visible on animal bones found at the same sites. The men ate their dead. They may have killed their living to eat. Given the circumstances, given the slow and terrible death by starvation and poisoning that they were facing across an empty landscape in the middle of an Arctic winter, this is not remotely surprising. Human beings in extremis do what they must, but to the Victorians, whose entire mythology of the Franklin expedition was built on the premise that the men had perished nobly and heroically in the service of empire and exploration, the suggestion was almost incomprehensible, a desecration of something sacred. Jane Franklin never accepted it. She spent decades and a considerable portion of her personal fortune organising search expeditions, shaping the public narrative, lobbying Parliament, and ensuring that her husband's legacy was constructed as one of heroic sacrifice rather than catastrophic failure. She succeeded remarkably well. The official monument to the Franklin expedition, erected in London's Waterloo Place, describes him as the discoverer of the Northwest Passage, a claim so audacious in the circumstances. The ships were stuck in the ice, the men were dying, nothing was discovered, that it has irritated historians ever since, though it has never been removed. The Franklin expedition was not, in the end, primarily about the Northwest Passage. It was about what happens when an institution, the Royal Navy, and a culture, Victorian Britain, becomes so committed to a particular version of how things ought to work that they cannot revise their assumptions even when the evidence against those assumptions is lying dead on the ice in front of them. It was about the peculiar arrogance of believing that willpower and good equipment and proper English breeding were sufficient preparation for the worst conditions on Earth. And it was about what the Arctic does, quietly and without malice, to everyone who underestimates it. The search for the Franklin expedition was one of the most sustained and expensive operations in the history of exploration, and it produced, as a side effect, the first systematic charting of the Canadian Arctic archipelago. Between 1848 and the late 1850s, more than 40 expeditions were sent to look for Franklin, sent by the British government, by the American Navy, by private individuals, and most persistently by Jane Franklin herself, who financed multiple search voyages out of her own pocket, and who treated the recovery of her husband's reputation as a personal mission of almost religious intensity. Many of these search expeditions encountered their own disasters. The ship sent out in 1848 under the joint command of James Clark Ross, the man who had been the first choice to command the Franklin expedition, and who must have been quietly aware of this as he set out to look for the ships that might have been his, got caught in the ice off Somerset Island and spent 2 winters frozen in, accomplishing nothing. Ross's second-in-command, Edward Byrd, became so severely incapacitated by scurvy that he had to be carried on and off his ship. The expedition returned to England in 1849 with no information about Franklin and having done serious damage to the health of its own crews. The following years brought a series of expeditions that each found fragments of evidence, a cairn here, a cache of abandoned equipment there, the graves on Beechey Island, but nothing that clarified what had actually happened or where the ships and their surviving crew might be. The search was hampered not only by the sheer size of the area being searched. The Canadian Arctic archipelago covers hundreds of thousands of square miles of ice and water and island, but also by the same institutional assumptions that had doomed Franklin in the first place. The search expeditions brought heavy ships into waters where light manoeuvrable vessels were needed. They relied on European sledging techniques when dog sleds would have been faster. They failed to ask the Inuit what they knew, which was quite a lot. The most dramatic of the search expeditions was probably the one organised in 1850 by Henry Grinnell, an American shipping magnate who had been moved by the fate of Franklin and his men, and who funded 2 ships, the Advance and the Rescue, under the command of Edwin de Haven to join the search. The American expedition accomplished little in material terms, but introduced to the Arctic world a young naval surgeon named Elisha Kent Kane, who would go on to lead his own search expedition in 1853 and produce through the account of that expedition one of the most widely read Arctic narratives of the 19th century. Kane was a remarkable figure, small, physically frail, afflicted by rheumatic fever that would ultimately kill him at 37, and possessed of a literary gift and a force of personality that made him, despite his physical limitations, a genuinely compelling leader. His second expedition, which spent 2 winters frozen in Smith Sound at the northern end of Baffin Bay, was a sustained exercise in improvisation and stubbornness. The ship, the Advance, was simply not capable of being freed from the ice, and the crew, who were slowly succumbing to scurvy and frostbite in a vessel that was progressively more damaged and less habitable, eventually made the extraordinary decision to abandon her and march 800 miles over the ice to the nearest Danish settlement in Greenland. They made it, barely, partly because Kane established contact with a nearby community of Inuit and learned from them the techniques of Arctic travel that the official expeditions had consistently refused to adopt. He wore Inuit clothing, or as close an approximation to it as his crew could manage, instead of the woolen uniforms that the Royal Navy considered appropriate. He learned to drive dog sleds. He ate what the Inuit ate, including the raw meat that his men initially found revolting, but which, unlike the preserved naval rations, prevented scurvy. He understood, in a way that very few of his contemporaries did, that the Inuit were not objects of curiosity but sources of knowledge, and that treating them as the former rather than the latter was a form of very expensive ignorance. Kane's book, published in 1856, was a bestseller on both sides of the Atlantic, and it shaped the popular imagination of the Arctic for a generation. But it also contained something that would have consequences well beyond anything Kane had intended. His descriptions of what he thought he'd glimpsed at the northern end of Smith Sound, open water, a sea free of ice, stretching away to the north toward the pole, reinvigorated the theory of the open polar sea with enormous force. Kane was a compelling writer and a credible witness, and if he said he had seen open water to the north, people believed him. What he had actually seen was a polynya, a persistent area of open water maintained by ocean currents and wind patterns, which was real enough but was not by any means the entrance to an ice-free Arctic Ocean. But the distinction between a polynya and an open polar sea was subtle and not easily communicated to a public that wanted to believe in the easier, more romantic version. The myth was refreshed. The obsession continued. Meanwhile, the actual answer to the question of what had happened to Franklin was finally obtained in 1859 by an expedition led by Francis Leopold McClintock, sent by Jane Franklin at her own expense after the British government had given up. McClintock found the written message on King William Island, the one with Crozier's desperate addendum scrawled around the margins. He found abandoned equipment and human remains. He found, in a ravine on the island, a boat mounted on a sledge, with 2 skeletons in it, and an extraordinary collection of objects scattered around and about. Chocolate, tea, silk handkerchiefs, curtain rods, sponges, slippers, and an enormous quantity of heavy silver plate, cutlery, and naval uniform buttons. The image of those dead men, surrounded by the debris of civilization in the middle of the Arctic wilderness, frozen into the ice of King William Island, became one of the defining images of the Victorian era. McClintock's report settled the question of what had happened, at least in its broad outlines, though the details continued to be debated and investigated for the next century and a half. But it did not settle the larger question, the one that the Franklin disaster had raised with such terrible force. What, if anything, had all of this cost been worth? What had the Arctic expeditions achieved? What justified the expenditure of lives and money and years that had gone into the search for the Northwest Passage and the search for the expedition that had died looking for it? The answer that the Victorian age gave to this question was complex and not entirely convincing, but it was sincerely held. The Arctic expeditions had extended the boundaries of human knowledge. They had charted waters that had been blank on every map. They had collected specimens and made observations that advanced the science of meteorology, magnetism, and natural history. And they had demonstrated, this was perhaps the argument made most insistently and with the most transparent wishful thinking, that the human spirit, properly disciplined and motivated by the right values, was capable of enduring anything. The Arctic, which had been killing people for all of this time, remained unmoved by the argument. 15 years after McClintock found the remains of the Franklin expedition, the ice of the high Arctic was still drawing men to their deaths, and the reasons were, in some ways, even more transparently absurd than they had been before. The new obsession was not the Northwest Passage, that had been effectively achieved in theory by the searchers, though not as a practical commercial route, but the North Pole itself and the competition to reach it had taken on the character of a sporting event, with different nations tracking each other's progress and keeping score in terms of furthest north, the highest latitude reached by any expedition. It was in this atmosphere of competitive record-keeping that the United States, a relatively late arrival to the Arctic exploration game, organised the Lady Franklin Bay Expedition of 1881, named for the bay on the northeastern coast of Ellesmere Island, where the expedition was to be established. The man chosen to lead it was Adolphus Greely, an Army Signal Corps officer who had distinguished himself in the Civil War, but had no Arctic experience whatsoever. This was not considered a disqualifying factor. The purpose of the expedition, as defined by the Army, was primarily scientific. It was to be part of the first International Polar Year, a coordinated effort by 12 nations to conduct simultaneous scientific observations at various points in the Arctic and subarctic. And for scientific observation, polar expertise was apparently considered less important than organisational ability and military discipline. Greely was a complex figure. By the testimony of the men who served under him, he was demanding, formal, occasionally petty, and inclined toward the enforcement of regulations in circumstances that perhaps called for more flexibility. He was also thorough, genuinely committed to the scientific mission, and possessed of the kind of stubborn optimism that can, in the right circumstances, sustain a community through extraordinary hardship, and that can, in the wrong circumstances, prevent the timely recognition that the situation is beyond recovery. The expedition established itself at Fort Conger on Lady Franklin Bay in August 1881 and spent 2 productive years conducting scientific observations, making geographical discoveries, and in August 1882 setting a new furthest north record when a small party reached 83 degrees 24 minutes north latitude, further north than anyone had ever been. The scientific work was excellent. The geographical work was excellent. The morale, under the circumstances, was reasonably good. The problem was the relief ships. The plan was simple. The expedition would be resupplied by ships sent north each summer. In 1882, a relief ship was sent. It was turned back by ice before it reached Lady Franklin Bay and deposited caches at various points in Smith Sound, none of them accessible to the expedition. In 1883, a second relief ship was sent. It was also turned back by ice. The Neptune left caches further south than the first ship had managed, in places that Greely, if he retreated south, might be able to find. The ship's captain, upon returning to Newfoundland without having reached the expedition, was celebrated in some quarters for having done the best he could. He was court-martialed in others for having turned back too soon. In August 1883, following his orders, which specified that if relief did not arrive, he was to retreat south and establish himself at a point where resupply would be more feasible, Greely and his 25 men abandoned Fort Conger and headed south by boat. It was a reasonable decision, made in accordance with explicit instructions. It was also, in practice, a death sentence because the caches left by the relief ships were inadequate, and because Greely had no way of knowing whether a third relief ship would be sent, or if so, where it would go. They wintered in a camp on Cape Sabine, on the coast of Ellesmere Island, in conditions that can only be described as extreme, even by the standards of Arctic hardship. They had minimal food, enough, on strict rationing, for perhaps 6 weeks, stretched over 6 months by reducing rations to a level that produced progressive starvation. They had tents and sleeping bags that were inadequate for Arctic temperatures. They had a boat they could not use because the sea was frozen. And they had each other, 25 men in very close quarters, slowly starving, watching the weakest among them die first and knowing that their own turn was coming. The deaths began in January. By June of 1884, when a relief expedition finally arrived, at Cape Sabine only 7 men remained alive, and of those 7, 1 died within hours of rescue and another died several days later. Of the 25 men who had left Fort Conger the previous summer, 18 were dead. But that is not the worst of it. The worst of it is what happened around the time of the deaths. Specifically, what happened to the bodies. Evidence found at Camp Clay and testimony given by survivors after the rescue strongly suggested that several of the men had been consuming the flesh of their dead comrades. Greely himself, in an account that was carefully worded but unmistakable in its implications, noted that the bodies of several of the dead had been found in a condition inconsistent with simple deterioration. When a reporter confronted him directly with the question, he neither confirmed nor denied it. The army conducted an investigation, concluded something unspecific but disturbing had occurred, and recommended against any detailed public disclosure, on the grounds that it would damage the reputation of the men who had died and of the service they represented. The reporter who had broken the story was effectively blacklisted from military press access. Greely, who had survived by virtue of being one of the stronger men in the group, and by maintaining strict authority for as long as he was physically able to do so, was eventually given a hero's welcome and a promotion, though the whispers about what had happened at Camp Clay never entirely went away. The Greely expedition is in many ways the American parallel to the Franklin disaster, not as large in scale or as surrounded by myth, but equally revealing about the relationship between military culture and the realities of Arctic survival. Like Franklin, Greely had been sent into the Arctic without adequate preparation for failure. Like Franklin, he had followed his orders with a literalness that contributed to the disaster. A more flexible reading of his instructions might, have led him to overwinter at Fort Conger rather than make the dangerous retreat south. And like Franklin, the survivors and their supporters spent years managing the story of what had happened, emphasizing the heroism and the scientific accomplishment and quietly glossing over the evidence that the experience had pushed some of the men well beyond the boundaries of civilized behavior. By the last decade of the 19th century, the North Pole had become the final remaining prize of terrestrial exploration, the one geographical achievement that had not yet been accomplished, the one blank spot remaining on the map of the Earth. It had acquired, in the public imagination of the United States and Europe, a significance entirely disproportionate to its actual geographical or scientific importance. The North Pole, after all, is just a point on the ice. There is no land there, no dramatic scenery, no particular reason to prefer it to any other point on the Arctic Ocean. But it was the top of the world, and the symbolic weight of that position was enormous. Robert Peary understood this better than almost anyone. Peary was a naval officer and a surveyor who had made his first visit to the Arctic in 1886, returned in 1891, and spent much of the following 2 decades pursuing the pole with a single-mindedness that was extraordinary, even by the standards of polar exploration obsession. He made 8 expeditions in total. He lost 8 of his toes to frostbite on one of them. He left behind him in Greenland at least 2 Inuit children, the products of relationships with Inuit women that he apparently considered unproblematic from a personal and professional standpoint, and that were not widely known about until long after his death. He removed from Greenland 6 meteorites sacred to the Inuit, the iron from which they had made their tools for generations, and sold them to the American Museum of Natural History. He transported to New York 6 Inuit individuals, for scientific study, 3 of whom died in the city within months of their arrival, apparently killed by tuberculosis against which they had no immunity. Peary was not a lovable man, but he was an effective one, in the narrow sense that he developed, through long trial and error, a genuine expertise in Arctic travel, specifically in the use of dog sleds and Inuit techniques, that made him, by around 1905, probably the most capable non-indigenous polar traveller in the world. Frederick Cook, his eventual rival, was a different sort of character entirely. He was a physician and explorer who had been to the Antarctic with the Belgica expedition of 1897 to 99, and who was, by all accounts, personally charming in a way that Peary conspicuously was not. He claimed to have made the first ascent of Denali, North America's highest mountain, in 1906, a claim that was subsequently challenged and is now generally regarded as false. Whether the Denali deception was a deliberate fraud or a genuine misremembering inflated by ambition is a question that cannot be definitively answered. What is clear is that Cook had a relationship with the truth that was less rigid than might have been ideal. On the 21st of September 1909, Cook arrived in Copenhagen from Greenland and announced that he had reached the North Pole on the 21st of April 1908, a year and a half earlier, before Peary's most recent attempt. He was greeted with enormous enthusiasm by a public that found him immediately likeable, and that was, in 1909, perfectly willing to take an explorer's word about what he had or hadn't accomplished in the middle of the Arctic, since verification was essentially impossible. 5 days later, Peary returned from his own expedition and announced that he had reached the North Pole on the 6th of April 1909. He simultaneously declared, with considerable force and through every available channel, that Cook was a liar, a fraud, and a scoundrel who had fabricated his entire story. Peary's supporters, and he had many, in high places, launched an immediate and sustained campaign to discredit Cook and to establish Peary's claim as the valid one. The controversy was, at the time, one of the most widely covered stories in the world. Both men presented their navigational records to various investigating bodies. The University of Copenhagen examined Cook's materials and found them inadequate to support his claim. A committee of the National Geographic Society examined Peary's materials and endorsed his claim. Congress eventually passed a bill formally recognizing Peary's achievement. The problem, which became increasingly clear as the 20th century went on, and people with more sophisticated navigational knowledge examined the available records, was that neither man could definitively prove he had reached the North Pole. The navigational instruments of the era, and the techniques available for using them in the extreme conditions of the Central Arctic, were simply not accurate enough to confirm a claim of this kind, particularly if, as Peary claimed, He had covered the last 150 miles in the implausibly fast time of 5 days. The arithmetic didn't work. The distances didn't add up. The time was too short for the speed to have been achievable. What appears most likely, based on the exhaustive analysis carried out by Wally Herbert, himself one of the greatest Arctic explorers of the 20th century and the man who made the first confirmed surface crossing of the Arctic Ocean, is that Peary came close to the pole but probably did not reach it, that his navigational records were either inaccurate or selectively presented, and that his vigorous campaign against Cook was in part motivated by the desire to ensure that whatever doubts might exist about his own achievement, Cook's competing claim would be so thoroughly destroyed that the comparison would not arise. Cook, for his part, almost certainly fabricated his claim entirely. There is almost no reliable evidence that he got anywhere near the pole. The North Pole controversy was not just a personal dispute between two ambitious and flawed men. It was the endpoint of a particular mode of exploration, the heroic individual conquest of a geographical objective that had organised Western thinking about the polar regions for 3 centuries. The discovery that neither of the leading claimants to the ultimate prize might have gotten there, that the records were inadequate, that the whole enterprise was, at some level, built on exaggeration and wishful thinking, this was quietly the end of something. The age of the heroic Arctic explorer, the age of men staking their lives and the lives of their crews on the conquest of frozen geography, was almost over, but before it ended, it had one more act to play. Part 8. The Carlock and the Canadian Arctic Expedition, a disaster that history forgot in June of 1913. A ship called the Carlock sailed north from Esquimalt, British Columbia, under the command of Robert Bartlett, one of the most experienced Arctic sailors alive, and under the scientific direction of Vilhjalmur Stephensen, one of the most controversial Arctic figures of his generation. The expedition, known as the Canadian Arctic Expedition, had 2 components: a northern party whose objectives were geographic and scientific, and a southern party with more specific oceanographic and biological goals. The Carlock was transporting the northern party. Stephensen was a Canadian-born ethnologist who had spent years living with Inuit communities in the Western Arctic, and who had developed, from this experience, a set of genuinely useful ideas about how to travel and survive in the north, and also a set of genuinely dangerous ideas about how easy it was. He promoted the concept of the friendly Arctic, the idea that the polar regions, properly understood and approached with the right techniques, were not particularly hostile and that a competent man could live off the land indefinitely. There was a kernel of truth in this. The Inuit did it. But Stephensen consistently underestimated the gap between what the Inuit could do, with their lifetime of experience and their deep cultural knowledge, and what a European expedition could do with a few learned techniques and a lot of confidence. In August of 1913, the Carlock became beset in ice off the North Alaskan coast. Stephensen, perhaps sensing what was coming, perhaps genuinely believing that a brief hunting trip was more useful than remaining on a trapped ship, went ashore with a small party ostensibly to hunt caribou, and was effectively cut off from the vessel by shifting ice. He never returned to the Carlock. Whether this was cowardice or opportunism or simply bad luck is a question that historians and his contemporaries argued about for decades without resolution. What is clear is that he walked away from his ship and his responsibility, leaving Bartlett in command of a vessel and crew in a rapidly deteriorating situation. The Carlock, locked in the ice, drifted west for months, carrying its crew of 25 men and women, including an Inuit family, a Scottish physicist named James Murray, a meteorologist and several sailors, helplessly across the Chukchi Sea. On the 11th of January 1914, the ice crushed the ship and it sank in the night. The crew made it off with supplies and equipment and established themselves on the ice, where they spent weeks in temperatures that dropped to -40 Fahrenheit, waiting for conditions that would allow them to reach land. Bartlett was the central figure in what followed, a combination of brilliant ice navigation, iron-willed leadership, and the kind of stubborn refusal to accept the arithmetic of doom that is either heroism or insanity depending on the circumstances. He organised the crew into groups and sent them off toward Wrangel Island, a large uninhabited Russian island some 90 miles north of the Siberian coast, while he and a single Inuit companion, a man named Kataktovik, undertook a journey to Siberia and eventually Alaska to organise a rescue. That journey, 700 miles across some of the most desolate terrain on Earth, in conditions of extreme cold, on foot and by dog sled, with inadequate food and equipment, is one of the genuine epics of Arctic travel. Bartlett made it. He reached Alaska, organised a rescue, and returned to Wrangel Island, where he found that 11 of the 25 who had been aboard the Karluk had died, some in accidents on the ice, some apparently in a deliberate group suicide or mercy killing when it became clear they were not going to survive, and some, by Bartlett's account and the accounts of others who were there, through failures of will and discipline that he did not specify further, but that clearly haunted him for the rest of his life. The Karluk disaster never achieved the cultural resonance of the Franklin expedition, partly because it ended with survivors, partly because the survivors' accounts were inconsistent and the full story was never publicly aired, and partly because the world had other things on its mind by 1914, when the war that would end the age of heroic exploration was beginning. But it is, in its own way, as revealing a story as any in the Arctic record, a story about the consequences of incompetent leadership, about the gap between theoretical knowledge of the Arctic and practical competence, and about what happens when human beings are pushed to the absolute edge of what they can endure. While the Western tradition of Arctic exploration was winding down in the aftermath of the First World War, something extraordinary was happening on the other side of the world. The Soviet Union, inheriting from Imperial Russia both the vast Arctic coastline of northern Eurasia and a well-developed tradition of Arctic science, had decided to do something with the polar regions that no one else had attempted: colonize them. This was not metaphorical colonization. The Soviet approach to the Arctic, especially from the early 1930s onward, involved the establishment of permanent scientific stations on the sea ice itself. Stations that would drift with the pack ice across the Arctic Ocean, their occupants making continuous observations about weather, oceanography and magnetism over periods of months or years. The first and most famous of these was North Pole 1, established in May 1937, when a group of 4 men, the glaciologist Pyotr Shirshov, the geophysicist Yevgeny Fedorov, the radio operator Ernst Krenkel, and the station leader Ivan Papanin, were landed by aircraft on an ice floe near the North Pole and left there to drift. The timing was not accidental. 1937 was also the year of the Great Terror, the apogee of Stalin's purges, and the North Pole 1 expedition was, among other things, a piece of propaganda designed to demonstrate Soviet technological and scientific superiority at a moment when the regime was simultaneously destroying enormous numbers of scientists, engineers, and military officers. The 4 men who drifted on the ice floe knew, as they settled in for their months of isolation, that their colleagues and friends were being arrested and shot at home, and that failure on the ice would be interpreted as sabotage or political unreliability. The pressure under which they operated was, in other words, quite different from the pressure under which Franklin or Greely or Peary had operated. They drifted for 9 months and covered approximately 1,500 miles before their ice floe began to break up, and they were rescued by an icebreaker in February 1938. The scientific data they collected was genuinely valuable. The propaganda value was enormous. Papanin, Krenkel, Fedorov and Shirshov returned to Moscow as heroes, greeted with parades and given apartments and medals and the attentive personal interest of Stalin himself. What followed, over the next several decades, was an enormous program of Soviet Arctic development that had no equivalent in the West. Dozens of drifting stations were established and sustained over the following years, their crew members cycling in and out by aircraft. Permanent shore-based research stations were built at dozens of locations along the Arctic coast and on Arctic islands. The Northern Sea Route, the passage along the Siberian coast that European explorers had been trying to navigate since the 16th century, was developed into an actual working shipping lane, maintained by a fleet of icebreakers and supported by a network of weather stations and radio beacons, and used extensively during the Second World War to move equipment to ports that the German Navy could not reach. The scale of this enterprise was staggering, and it was largely invisible to the West during the Cold War because the Soviet Union was, for obvious reasons, disinclined to share detailed information about its Arctic activities. The bases served military as well as scientific purposes. Submarines operating under the Arctic ice were a significant component of Soviet nuclear strategy, and the network of observation stations provided coverage that was valuable for both weather forecasting and submarine tracking. The full extent of Soviet Arctic military activity was one of the most closely held secrets of the Cold War, and even after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the picture has only slowly become clearer. But the human stories of Soviet Arctic service are remarkable in their own right. The people sent to staff the drift stations and the remote shore bases were, in many cases, not volunteers in any meaningful sense. The Soviet system of professional assignment meant that a scientist or engineer could simply be told they were going to the Arctic and would be spending the next year or two on drifting ice. And that was the end of the discussion. The psychological pressure of complete isolation, combined with the physical demands of the environment, and the political pressure of knowing that anything less than complete success would be interpreted as ideological failure, produced cases of breakdown and crisis that were classified and suppressed. What is known is that the Soviet program, whatever its costs, produced a genuinely impressive body of Arctic science. The oceanographic data collected from the drift stations, integrated over decades of continuous measurement, provided a picture of the Arctic Ocean's currents, temperatures, and ice dynamics that had no equivalent in the Western scientific record. When, in the late 20th century, climatologists began trying to understand the mechanisms of Arctic climate change, the Soviet data, slowly becoming available through scientific exchanges and archive access, proved invaluable. There is a kind of irony in this. The Soviet Arctic program, born of Stalinist propaganda and sustained by the same coercive state machinery that was simultaneously destroying the lives of millions of Soviet citizens, produced scientific data that has contributed materially to our understanding of the climate crisis that is now transforming the Arctic more rapidly than at any time in human history. The men who drifted on the ice, working under conditions of extreme physical hardship and political terror, were collecting evidence for a transformation of the Arctic that none of them could have imagined, and that none of them would have chosen. The ice they studied so carefully is now disappearing. On the 3rd of September 2014, a small underwater vehicle named the Investigator, operated by Parks Canada's Underwater Archaeology Team, descended through the cold water of Victoria Strait in the Canadian Arctic and found something that had been missing for 168 years, the wreck of HMS Erebus, Sir John Franklin's flagship, resting on the seabed in approximately 36 feet of water, upright and substantially intact. The discovery was the culmination of years of searching and the product of a set of circumstances that would have seemed improbable even a decade earlier. The ice conditions in Victoria Strait, which had been consistently heavy throughout the historical period of the searches for Franklin in the 19th century, had by the 2014 season been significantly reduced by the warming Arctic climate, making it possible for the search vessels to operate in areas that had previously been inaccessible. The Arctic was giving up its secrets, but only because the ice that had kept them was melting. 2 years later, HMS Terror was found in an extraordinarily well-preserved state in Terror Bay on the south coast of King William Island, a location considerably further south than the written record had suggested the ships were, which implied either that the ships had been moved by the ice after being abandoned, or that some of the crew had managed to free at least one of them and sail it south before finally losing the battle with the Arctic. The Inuit oral traditions, which had consistently claimed that the ships moved after the Europeans abandoned them, turned out to be accurate, a reminder, as if any more were needed, that the knowledge that had been available all along and that the official searches had systematically discounted was reliable. The wrecks have been photographed extensively and, in the case of Erebus, partially entered by divers. What they have found has been both extraordinary and poignant. The ships are remarkably well preserved. By the cold water, with furniture still in place, dishes still in their racks, objects still where they were, last put down 168 years ago. The personal effects of the officers are still there. The navigational charts are still there. In the stern cabin of the Erebus, where Franklin would have worked and slept in the final months before his death, there are objects that were put there in 1846 and have not been touched since. The ongoing archaeological work on the Franklin wrecks is, in a sense, a continuation of the Victorian searches. The same question, asked again after all this time, what happened? The wrecks are yielding information slowly and carefully, because the archaeologists are acutely aware that everything in those cold cabins and cargo holds is irreplaceable, and that whatever the Franklin expedition did in those final months, the physical evidence of it deserves to be treated with more care than the expedition itself received. The disappearance of Arctic ice is also revealing other things that were hidden. Permafrost melting across the Siberian tundra is exposing the carcasses of mammoths and other Pleistocene megafauna with increasing frequency, perfectly preserved by thousands of years of deep freeze, offering paleontologists and geneticists material that would have been unimaginable a generation ago. In Greenland and the Canadian Arctic, sites that were covered by glacier ice for centuries, including apparently some Norse sites, are emerging into the open air for the first time since the medieval warm period. The archaeology of the Viking Age in the North Atlantic is being written and rewritten by the changing climate in real time. The irony is almost too neat. The same process that is devastating the Arctic ecosystem, warming temperatures, melting ice, shrinking permafrost, is simultaneously making accessible the physical record of the human past in the Arctic in a way that has never before been possible. Every summer that is warmer than the last, every year that the sea ice retreats a little further, a few more objects that were locked in the ice emerge. A few more wrecks become accessible. A few more stories that the Arctic has been keeping for generations are returned to the people who are now belatedly ready to listen. This is not a comfort, exactly. The climate crisis is real, and its consequences for the Arctic are severe, and no archaeological discovery, however remarkable, justifies or compensates for the destruction of an ecosystem that has sustained human and non-human life for thousands of years. But it is a reminder, the kind of reminder that only the very long view of history can provide, that the relationship between human beings and the Arctic has always been more complicated and more reciprocal than the simple narrative of conquest and disaster suggests. Long before any naval expedition planted a flag in the ice of the far north, before the Admiralty sent its elegant bomb vessels into Lancaster Sound or the American newspapers celebrated their polar heroes, the Arctic was being worked. Systematically, ruthlessly, and with a commercial efficiency that would have impressed even the most hard-nosed Victorian industrialists, the whalers were reducing the populations of the great whales of the Northern Ocean with a thoroughness that today we would recognise as ecological catastrophe, but that to the men involved seemed simply like good business. The English whaling industry in the Arctic dated to the early 17th century, when a Muscovy Company expedition found the waters around Spitsbergen, the archipelago 600 miles north of Norway, so thick with bowhead whales that the crews were, by several accounts, almost unable to navigate without pushing the animals out of the way. The bowhead whale, a massive creature that can reach 60 feet in length and 80 tons in weight, was the prize of the northern fishery for two reasons. It was slow-moving enough to be caught by men in open rowing boats, and it floated when dead because of its enormous reserves of blubber, which meant it could be towed back to the mothership or to shore for rendering. Its oil illuminated the cities of Europe. Its baleen, the flexible plates of keratin in its mouth that it used to filter krill from the seawater, was the primary structural material of the 18th century's version of the plastic industry, used in everything from umbrella ribs to the staves of the corsets that gave aristocratic women the figures that fashion demanded. The efficiency with which the bowhead population of Spitsbergen was destroyed is almost breathtaking in retrospect. Within 30 years of the discovery of the fishery, the whales were commercially extinct in the waters around Spitsbergen itself, and the whalers had to follow the retreating population north and east and eventually west, around the northern coast of Greenland and into the Davis, Strait and Baffin Bay. The Dutch, the English, the Germans, the Danes, and eventually the Americans followed the whales wherever they went, and the whales went further and further into the ice, because the ice was the only place where the ships couldn't easily follow. What the whalers learned, in the course of following the whales into waters of increasing difficulty and danger, was an immense body of practical knowledge about the Arctic. They learned how to read the ice, the different colours and textures that indicated different thicknesses and ages, the sounds that indicated movement and pressure, the smells that sometimes gave warning of open water ahead. They learned the patterns of the seasons, the predictable times when certain leads opened and certain routes became possible. They learned the geography of the bays and inlets and straits through which they pursued their quarry, often before any official chart maker had been there, producing manuscript charts that circulated among the whaling community but rarely reached the desks of the Admiralty or the walls of geographical societies. The Scottish whalers of Dundee and Peterhead were perhaps the most consistently skilled Arctic sailors of the 19th century. They worked the Baffin Bay fishery year after year, generation after generation, and they developed a community of practice and a body of local knowledge that was extraordinary. Dundee captains knew the ice of Baffin Bay the way farmers know their fields, by long familiarity, by years of accumulated observation, by the kind of deep pattern recognition that you cannot acquire from books or charts, but only from time spent in a place, paying attention. When John Franklin's expedition was being organised in 1845, several experienced whaling captains offered their advice and their knowledge of the waters where the expedition was heading. William Penny, a Dundee whaling captain with extensive experience in Baffin Bay and the approach to Lancaster Sound, specifically recommended against the route that Franklin was planning to take at the time of the year he was planning to take it. His warnings were noted, considered, and politely set aside by the Admiralty, which had more confidence in its own methods than in the empirical wisdom of a commercial fisherman. Penny was right, but his being right did not save Franklin, and it did not change the fundamental relationship between the official exploration establishment and the commercial sailors whose knowledge they consistently undervalued. The whaling industry also brought to the Arctic something that would have long-term consequences for both the ecosystem and the culture of indigenous peoples. Sustained, large-scale contact between Europeans and Inuit across an enormous geographical range. This contact was complex and ambiguous in its effects. At its best, it involved genuine exchange, European technology for Inuit knowledge and labour, with both sides benefiting from the transaction. At its worst, it involved the introduction of alcohol, epidemic diseases, and a market economy that disrupted the subsistence systems on which Inuit communities depended. The smallpox and influenza epidemics that swept through Inuit populations following contact with European whalers in the 19th and early 20th centuries killed proportions of those populations comparable to what the Black Death had done to Europe, sometimes higher. By the early 20th century, the commercial whale populations of the Arctic were so severely depleted that the industry itself was in terminal decline. The last great bowhead whale fisheries were in the Western Arctic, in the Beaufort Sea and the waters around the Mackenzie Delta, and they too were hunted to commercial extinction in the early years of the century. The whalers who had mapped the Arctic, who had accumulated generations of knowledge about its waters and its ice, who had sustained whole communities in Scotland and New England and the Azores on the proceeds of their work in the far north, they were gone, their ships rotting, their knowledge dispersing as the men who held it aged and died without passing it on to successors who would have use for it. What remained was the ice, the whales that were left, and the Inuit communities that had been transformed by the century of intensive contact. And what remained, in the archives and the manuscript charts and the logbooks that survived in ships' chandlers and counting houses and occasionally in museums, was the most comprehensive practical record of the Arctic that anyone had ever assembled. A record that researchers are still mining today, finding in the daily observations of whaling captains' logs the baseline data against which the changes wrought by the modern climate crisis can be measured. The whalers, who cared nothing for posterity and everything for the next catch, left behind, inadvertently and without knowing it, one of the most valuable historical records in the entire literature of climate science. There is a particular quality to the objects that the Arctic preserves that is unlike anything produced by any other archaeological context. In Egypt, the dry heat of the desert mummifies organic material, leaving it technically preserved but fragile, desiccated, reduced to the consistency of paper. In peat bogs, the cold and acid environment creates its own strange chemistry, producing bodies of extraordinary softness and colour, but frozen in attitudes of violent death. In the Arctic, the cold is so absolute and the conditions so stable that objects can be preserved in a state that seems, at first encounter, almost impossible, as if time has simply stopped and the thing in front of you was placed there yesterday rather than a century or two ago. The men who have retrieved objects from the Franklin wrecks in recent years have described the experience in almost exactly these terms. In the stern cabin of the Erebus, which was Franklin's own cabin and the most private space on the ship, archaeologists found, among other things, a writing desk with compartments that still contained their original contents, stationery, sealing wax, a small personal library. The desk had been there since 1847, since the last time anyone on the ship was alive to use it, and it retained not just its physical integrity, but something harder to describe, a sense of presence, of interrupted activity, of a life that had simply stopped mid-sentence. This quality of Arctic preservation has produced over the years a series of archaeological discoveries that have reshaped our understanding not just of the specific events they illuminate, but of the broader history of human activity in the North. The Beechy Island burials, the 3 graves of Franklin expedition men who died during the first winter, were remarkable enough when they were found in the 1850s. When the bodies were exhumed in 1984 by a team led by Owen Beattie of the University of Alberta, the preservation was astonishing. John Torrington, the first to be exhumed, had been dead for 138 years. He looked as if he had died weeks ago. His eyes were partially open. The expression on his face was one that the team described somewhat reluctantly as peaceful. Beattie's team took tissue samples from all 3 bodies, Torrington, John Hartnell and William Brain, and submitted them to detailed chemical analysis. The results were extraordinary. All 3 men had elevated lead levels in their tissue that were consistent with chronic lead poisoning, suggesting either that the soldered seams of the expedition's tinned food had been leaching lead into the contents, or that the expedition's water system, which used lead pipes, was the source, or some combination of both. These findings sparked a controversy that has continued for decades, with some researchers arguing that the lead levels were high, enough to cause significant cognitive impairment, impaired judgment, confusion, fatigue, depression, and others arguing that while the lead was elevated, its effects have been overstated. What is not in dispute is that the conditions aboard the Franklin expedition ships were significantly worse than anyone at the time realized or admitted. The tinned food, supplied by a contractor named Goldner, who had won the Admiralty contract by underbidding his competitors and had apparently compensated for his thin margins by skimping on the manufacturing process, was not only potentially lead-contaminated, but may have been badly sealed, leading to bacterial contamination and food that was nutritionally degraded or actively toxic. The evidence for this comes from the discovery, at various sites on King William Island, of tins that had been opened and their contents discarded, apparent evidence that the men had discovered their food was bad and had chosen to go without rather than eat it. 129 men, equipped with the best technology the most powerful navy in the world could provide, were dying of lead poisoning, scurvy, and possibly botulism in ships locked in the ice, in an ocean that their culture had assured them was navigable if you just had the right attitude and enough provisions. The gap between the imagined Arctic and the actual one had rarely been demonstrated with such terrible precision. The archaeology of other Arctic disasters tells similarly precise stories. The site of the Greely expedition's winter camp at Cape Sabine was excavated in the 20th century and yielded artifacts that confirmed and elaborated the documentary record. Cut bones, the remains of meals that included items no one would have considered eating under normal circumstances, and personal effects that told the individual stories of the men who had died there. The archaeology turned the abstract historical disaster into something human-scaled and specific, giving back to the dead their individuality and making the story of what happened in that camp something other than a statistic. In Greenland, the excavation of a Norse farm site has produced detailed pictures of life in the medieval colonies that no written source could have provided. The bones from Norse middens tell stories about diet and health that suggest the late period of the settlements was characterized by increasing nutritional stress. The people were eating more seal and less domesticated livestock, suggesting their farming was failing, and the children's bones showed growth interruptions consistent with periodic near-starvation. The final years of the Norse Greenland settlements, in other words, were not a sudden collapse but a long decline, a slow grinding down of a community that was just barely holding on, and that eventually, over the course of several generations, simply lost the margin it needed to survive. The archaeology of the Arctic, accumulating gradually and now accelerating as the ice recedes and more sites become accessible, is building a record of human experience in the far north that is richer and more specific than anything that was previously available. It is a record built not from the accounts of famous men and official expeditions, but from the physical evidence left behind by everyone who was ever there. The Norse farmers and the Inuit hunters, and the British sailors and the Soviet scientists and all the others, named and unnamed, who lived and died in one of the most demanding environments on Earth. That record is telling us something important, and it is something that the great explorers of the age of heroic exploration either did not understand or could not accept. The Arctic is not a place to be conquered, it is a place to be learned. Every expedition that went there with conquest in mind eventually encountered this truth, often at catastrophic cost. Every expedition that went there with the intention of learning, the Inuit who built their culture around the ice, the whalers who spent their careers reading it, the scientists who devoted their lives to measuring it, found something that was genuinely worth knowing. There is a question that runs through the entire history of Arctic exploration, and that has never been satisfactorily answered, perhaps because the answer is not a comfortable one. Why? Why did generation after generation of men, and they were, with rare exceptions, men, keep going back to the place that had killed so many of their predecessors? The economic explanations account for some of it, at some periods. The military and political explanations account for some more, but they don't account for all of it, and they don't account for the specific flavour of intensity that Arctic exploration has always carried. The obsessiveness, the willingness to sacrifice everything, the quality that Jane Franklin identified in her husband, and that she herself displayed in a different register, the inability to stop. One answer is that the Arctic offers a particular kind of clarity. The conditions there strip away everything that is not essential, all the social performance, all the comfortable habits, all the insulating layers of civilization that normally cushion people from the raw facts of their situation. In the Arctic, you know exactly what you need: warmth, food, shelter, water, the ability to navigate. You know exactly what will kill you if you fail to provide these things. The simplicity is brutal, but it is also, for some people, something like relief. A relief from the complexity and ambiguity of ordinary life, the clarity of a situation in which the stakes are absolute and the rules are clear. This is, of course, a particular kind of privilege talking. The people who found the Arctic clarifying in this way were, almost without exception, people who were fleeing a complicated civilian life toward the imagined simplicity of extreme experience. The men who actually lived in the Arctic, the Inuit hunters, the whalers, the Soviet scientists on their drifting stations, experienced it rather differently. For them the complexity was internal and social, the kind that comes from living in very close quarters with a small number of other people for extended periods, and the simplicity was external and lethal, the ice that killed you if you misread it, the cold that killed you if you were inadequately clothed, the starvation that killed you if the hunt failed. Another answer is that the Arctic offered, especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries, one of the few remaining contexts in which an individual could make a genuinely significant contribution to the geographical knowledge of the world. The world was being mapped, rapidly and systematically, and there were very few places left where an explorer could go and know that no one before them had been there. No one had named the things they were looking at, no one had recorded the depths and the currents and the weather patterns. The Arctic was one of those places, a vast blank on the map in which a man could quite literally write his name. The appeal of this, to ambitious men in an age that worshipped geographical discovery, is easy to understand. But there is a third answer, and it is the one that is hardest to articulate, but that is probably the most true. The Arctic is genuinely, deeply beautiful, in ways that no description adequately captures, and that, for many of the people who have seen it, operates as a kind of addiction. The light in the Arctic, the particular quality of the light at high latitudes, the way it interacts with the ice and the water and the sky to produce colours and effects that simply do not exist at lower latitudes, has been described by people who are otherwise perfectly practical and unsentimental in terms that sound like religious experience. The midnight sun, the aurora borealis, the way a field of sea ice looks under the low angle of the autumn sun, each pressure ridge casting a shadow that turns it from white to indigo. The absolute silence of the interior on a calm day, a silence so complete that you can hear the blood moving in your own ears. People go back because they have seen this. They go back because, having seen it once, nothing else is quite adequate. They go back because the Arctic, which kills without compunction and preserves without compassion, is also more beautiful than anywhere else on Earth, in ways that the people it kills and the people it preserves carry with them to the end. Ernest Shackleton, who never led an Arctic expedition, but whose Antarctic experiences gave him a perspective that transfers directly, said late in his life that the wildness of the polar regions got into a man's blood and never fully left. He meant it literally, and he meant it as a warning, and he meant it you sense, as a confession, the acknowledgement of a man who knew perfectly well that the thing he was doing was probably going to kill him, and who was going anyway, because there was no other place where he felt fully alive. The explorers who came back from the Arctic, the survivors, the ones who made it out, described the experience in ways that were consistent across time and across very different personal and cultural backgrounds. They described a heightening of perception, a sense that in the Arctic everything mattered and nothing was irrelevant. They described a clarity of purpose that they never found again in civilian life, and they described, almost universally, a persistent pull back toward the North. Not because the North was kind to them, not because it had been anything other than brutal and indifferent and occasionally murderous, but because it was real in a way that nowhere else quite managed to be. This is the final secret of the Arctic, the one that all the history of disaster and obsession and forbidden expedition is ultimately pointing toward. The ice does not merely preserve the bodies of the dead and the artifacts of the past. It preserves something in the living too, some quality of attention, some sharpness of awareness, some fundamental engagement with the fact of existence, that the comfortable, insulated, mediated world of civilization tends to erode. The men who went into the Arctic and came back were changed by it. The ones who went and didn't come back, whose bones are still there in the permafrost, whose ships are still there on the seabed, whose names are still on the cairns and the capes and the straits they discovered or died near, were changed by it too, in the last hours of their lives, in ways that no one will ever know. The ice kept their secrets. Now the ice is melting, and as it goes, returning to the world the evidence of all those lives and all those journeys and all those acts of courage and folly and desperation and wonder, it is asking us a question that we have not yet figured out how to answer. What do we do with the knowledge that all of this cost? What do we owe to the people who paid that cost? The dead explorers and the living Inuit, the drowned sailors and the surviving ecosystems, the men whose names are on the maps and the people whose names are in no map but who knew the ice better than anyone. The Arctic does not offer answers. It offers only the ice and the silence and the long, slow process of revelation that comes when the ice is gone. Listen to that silence carefully. There is more history in it than in any library. The Northwest Passage was first navigated by Roald Amundsen between 1903 and 1906, in a voyage that was so unlike the expeditions that had preceded it, in its methods and its philosophy and its fundamental approach to the question of how to survive in the Arctic, that it almost seems to belong to a different tradition entirely. Where the British expeditions had sent large ships carrying large crews and enormous quantities of provisions and equipment, Amundsen sailed a 47-ton sloop, the Dewar, a vessel smaller than many modern recreational sailing yachts, with a crew of 6, where the British had imposed their own routines and dietary habits on an environment that was entirely indifferent to them. Amundsen spent the first 2 winters of his voyage learning from the Netsilik Inuit, who lived near his winter anchorage on King William Island, the same island where the bones of Franklin's men lay scattered across the tundra. What Amundsen learned from the Netsilik was not merely practical technique, though the practical technique was invaluable. How to build effective clothing from caribou skins, how to drive a dog team, how to read ice and snow for signs of safe passage, how to hunt the animals of the Arctic efficiently enough to supplement the expedition's provisions rather than depleting them. He also absorbed something more fundamental, something about the pace and rhythm of life in the Arctic, the understanding that the environment operated on its own schedule, and that the human role was not to impose a different schedule, but to work with the one that was already there. The 2 winters at Uahaun, as Amundsen named his anchorage, were not dead time. They were time spent accumulating knowledge. The crew conducted magnetic observations that were genuinely valuable to science. They mapped coastline and made meteorological measurements, and they watched and listened and asked questions, and the Netsilik answered, and by the time Amundsen was ready to move west in the summer of 1905, he was better prepared for the remaining passage than any European explorer who had ever attempted anything similar. The route through the archipelago was still ice-choked and dangerous. The Dewar drew only about 3 feet of water, shallower than any previous expedition vessel, and this allowed her to navigate channels and passages that would have been impossible for larger ships, including the southern route through Simpson Strait and Ray Strait that no one had previously attempted because everyone assumed it was too shallow. The assumption was based on the charts, and the charts were based on the incomplete surveys of earlier expeditions, and so there existed, right there on the map, a navigable passage that no one had tried because no one had been confident enough in the accuracy of the charts to trust them. Amundsen trusted them, or rather, he trusted his own careful navigation more than the assumptions that previous expeditions had brought to the question, and he found that the shallow draft Gjør could make it through where no other ship had gone. On the morning of August 26, 1905, after 2 years in the ice, Amundsen sighted a whaling ship coming from the west, and knew, with the sudden and absolute certainty of that moment, that the passage was his. He had made it through. He had connected the Atlantic to the Pacific by sea across the top of the world. He did not immediately return to civilization. He spent another winter frozen in on the Alaskan coast and did not reach San Francisco and the waiting telegraphs and the waiting world until 1906. The reception was somewhat muted, partly because Amundsen's understated style did not lend itself to the kind of dramatic narrative that the Victorian and Edwardian public had been trained to expect from their Arctic heroes, and partly because the world was changing, the age of geographical exploration was ending, and the public imagination was already shifting toward other frontiers. But Amundsen understood exactly what he had done. He had solved the problem that had killed hundreds of men over 3 centuries, not by applying more force or more resources or more colonial willpower, but by being smaller, more flexible, more willing to learn, and less attached to the idea that the appropriate way to approach the Arctic was as an adversary to be defeated. He had, in a sense, understood what the Inuit had always understood, that the Arctic was not an obstacle, but an environment, and that success within it required working with its logic rather than against it. The irony, of course, is that the Northwest Passage that Amundsen navigated with such care and skill is now, in the early 21st century, becoming commercially navigable for much of the year, not because human technology has finally matched the challenge, but because the ice that made it so dangerous is disappearing. The Arctic Ocean is warming faster than any other body of water on Earth, and the summer sea ice that has defined the character of the passage for the entire span of human history is retreating at a rate that has no precedent in the geological record. In some recent summers, the passage has been open to ordinary commercial shipping for months at a time, without the need for icebreakers or specialized ice-class vessels. This is, in one sense, the fulfillment of the dream that killed so many people. A navigable northern passage, shorter than the routes through the Panama Canal, connecting the major oceans of the world. Shipping companies and national governments are already planning for the day when it's routinely usable. The geopolitical implications are enormous. Questions of sovereignty, of environmental protection, of the rights of Arctic nations and Arctic indigenous peoples are already generating disputes that will be among the most contentious international issues of the coming decades. But it is a fulfillment that would have horrified the men who died seeking it, because the price paid for it is the destruction of the very thing that defined the Arctic, the ice itself. The passage is opening because the ice is gone, and the ice is gone because of processes set in motion, ultimately, by the industrial civilization that sent the expeditions in the first place. The same fossil fuels that powered the steam engines of the Victorian naval vessels that crashed through the pack ice have, over a century and a half of accumulation in the atmosphere, warmed the planet enough to melt the ice those ships could not break. It is a historical irony so large that it is difficult to fully comprehend. The great Arctic expeditions were driven in part by the commercial ambition of industrial civilization, by the desire to find shorter trade routes, new resources, new territories. The industrial civilization that drove them has produced as a byproduct of its own success the melting of the Arctic. The dream is coming true in the worst possible way. There are things that the Arctic still refuses to give back. There are questions that the archaeologists and the historians and the divers have not yet answered, questions that may never be answered, questions that the ice keeps not out of malice, but simply because the evidence is too scattered, too deep, too thoroughly distributed across too many square miles of frozen landscape and frozen sea to be recovered in any complete form. We do not know exactly what happened to Francis Crozier. We know he was alive on the 25th of April 1848 when he signed the last message from the Franklin expedition. We know he was leading 104 men south across King William Island toward the Back River. We know none of them made it, but we do not know where he died or how, or what he thought and felt in those final weeks as the last of his men fell behind and the coast ahead refused to yield the salvation he was looking for. The man who was probably the best qualified of anyone on those ships to survive, the most experienced, the most practical, the most clear-eyed, left no record of his end. We do not know what happened on the Franklin ships between the death of Franklin in June 1847 and the abandonment in April 1848. We know that 24 men died in that period, an unusually high number that suggests conditions aboard the locked ships were deteriorating rapidly. We know that a large amount of equipment was left on the ships when they were abandoned, equipment that would have been useful for survival and that therefore should have been taken. We do not know whether this represents a rational decision made under extreme cognitive impairment or organisational breakdown, or simply the impossibility of carrying everything that needed to be carried. The ships are there. The answers, if they exist at all, are inside them. We do not know what the Norse colonists of Greenland knew about the land to the west. We know from the sagas that they went there, to Vinland, to Markland, to Helluland, and we know from the archaeology of Lonso Meadows that at least some of them established a temporary presence in Newfoundland. But the sagas are literary texts, shaped by the conventions and purposes of the age in which they were written down, and they tell us only what the people who wrote them wanted to preserve. What was ordinary, what was routine, what was the daily texture of Norse activity in the Western Atlantic over the 3 or 4 centuries of the Greenland colony's existence? This we do not know, and the evidence that might tell us is scattered across thousands of miles of coastline in conditions that make systematic archaeological survey almost impossibly difficult. We do not know the full story of the Soviet Arctic program, the records of the drifting ice stations, the shore-based research facilities, the military installations that operated throughout the Cold War period on the sea ice and the Arctic coast, are held in archives that are still largely inaccessible, either because they remain classified by the Russian government, or because they were destroyed during the chaotic period following the Soviet collapse. The human stories, the accidents, the breakdowns, the deaths, the acts of heroism and cowardice, and simple endurance that must have characterized 30 years of intensive Arctic activity, are mostly lost. The Arctic keeps its secrets with the same quiet thoroughness that it has always kept them, whether the secret is the fate of a Victorian expedition or the classified activities of a Cold War superpower. The cold does not discriminate. It preserves what it preserves and destroys what it destroys according to rules that have nothing to do with historical importance or human need to know. But the Arctic is changing. Every year, the boundary of what the ice keeps and what it releases shifts a little further north, retreats a little further from the coasts and the shipping lanes and the archaeological sites. The thawing permafrost is releasing organic material that has been locked in the ground since the Pleistocene. Ancient microbes, ancient carbon, ancient questions about what the world was like before human memory. The retreating glaciers are uncovering landscapes that have not seen sunlight since before the birth of Christ. The warming ocean is reshaping the entire ecosystem of the North, from the algae at the base of the food chain to the polar bears at the top, in ways that are already irreversible, and that will continue for decades regardless of what is done about emissions in the coming years. In this context, the history of Arctic exploration is not merely a collection of interesting stories about brave and foolish men. It is an extended meditation on the relationship between human ambition and environmental reality. A meditation conducted over 1,000 years, in conditions of extraordinary difficulty, with costs that were paid in lives and suffering that we can barely imagine. The lesson of that meditation is not comfortable, and it is not simple, but it is consistent. The Arctic has its own rules. It has always had its own rules. Every civilization that has encountered it has discovered this, and the civilizations that survived the encounter were the ones that learned to live within those rules rather than attempting to override them. That lesson, learned so many times at such enormous cost, is the most important thing the Arctic has to tell us now. Now, when the rules themselves are changing, when the ice that enforced the rules for 10,000 years of human history is melting, when the consequences of not learning the lesson are no longer confined to the people bold enough or foolish enough to venture into the ice, but are being felt across the entire surface of the planet. The men who died on King William Island, whose bones are scattered across the tundra in the care of a landscape that asks nothing of them and expects nothing and simply holds them, cold and quiet, in the oldest museum in the world, they paid a particular price for a particular failure of understanding. They could not, in fairness, have done otherwise, given who they were and when they lived, and what their culture had prepared them to believe about the world. We are not in that position. We have the history, we have the archaeology, we have the science, we have preserved in the ice cores and the permafrost and the bones and the ship timbers and the logbooks and the navigational records of 1,000 years of Arctic activity. Record of what happens when human beings underestimate the complexity and the power of the natural world. The question is whether we will do what the great explorers never managed to do. Read the record, understand what it says, and change our course before the ice is entirely gone. And the evidence, along with the environment that preserved it, exists only in the pages of history. Every account of Arctic exploration that reaches us from the historical record is, in some fundamental way, incomplete. The written sources, the expedition journals, the official reports, the published narratives, the letters sent home before the ships disappeared into the ice, were produced by a tiny fraction of the people involved in the enterprise, almost exclusively the educated officers and gentlemen scientists who commanded the expeditions, and who had both the literacy and the leisure to keep extended written records. The ordinary seamen, the stokers and the sailmakers and the cooks, the men who actually did the physical work of keeping the ships moving and the crews alive, left almost nothing in writing. Their experience of the same events was, by any reasonable inference, substantially different from what the officers described, and we will never know exactly how. The Inuit voices are even more systematically absent from the conventional record. There were Inuit people who witnessed significant events in the history of Arctic exploration, who saw the Franklin ships, who found the bodies of the men, who traded with or worked alongside European expeditions for generations, and their testimony was collected, in fragmentary and mediated form, by the handful of researchers who thought to seek it. Charles Francis Hall, the American explorer who spent years in the 1860s living with Inuit communities and collecting oral histories about the Franklin expedition, preserved testimony that has proven remarkably accurate in its details and that the professional archaeological establishment took far too long to take seriously. The Inuit, in his accounts, described ships that moved after the Europeans left them, which the experts dismissed as impossible until the location of HMS Terror proved it true. The oral histories of the Arctic peoples, not just the Inuit but the Yupik, the Inupiat, the Chukchi, the peoples of the Siberian Arctic coast, contain knowledge about the history of the region, about its past climate and its past ecology, and its past patterns of human activity, that has no equivalent in the written record. This knowledge is now, like the ice itself, at risk of disappearing, not through the failure of the people who hold it, but through the disruption of the cultural transmission systems that have carried it across generations, disruption caused by exactly the same forces of industrial civilization that are melting the ice. Recording and preserving that knowledge, not as an artifact but as a living tradition, in the communities and in the language in which it was developed, is perhaps the most urgent task facing anyone who cares about the history of the Arctic and about what that history has to teach the rest of the world. The ice gave us time to learn, time to change. The question has always been whether we would use it. The men whose names grace the capes and the bays and the straits of the Canadian Arctic archipelago, Franklin and Crozier, Davis and Baffin, Parry and Ross, Greely and Kane, were neither heroes nor villains in any simple sense. They were products of their time and their culture, animated by genuine courage and genuine curiosity and genuine blindness in roughly equal measure. They went to the ice with everything their civilization gave them and discovered, repeatedly and often fatally, that their civilization had not given them enough. They died for a passage that turned out to be real, but not navigable in any practical sense for ordinary ships, not because the geography was wrong, but because the climate in the era of those expeditions simply did not allow it. They died for a pole that was just a point on the ice, no different from any other point on the ice, except in the significance that human ambition had loaded onto it. They died in the end because they could not stop going, and the Arctic, which has no sympathy for the narratives that humans construct to justify their ambitions, did what it always does when humans push past the limits of what is safe. The Arctic is still there, the ice is still there, though less of it with every passing season. The bones are still there, and the wrecks, and the cairns with their messages placed in them by dying men who wanted someone, someday, to know what had happened. The knowledge is still there, in the archives, in the archaeological sites, in the oral traditions of the people who have always lived there, waiting to be read by anyone willing to take it seriously, and somewhere under the cold black water of Victoria Strait, in a cabin that has been sealed for 170 years, there may be papers that will tell us at last the things that Francis Crozier knew and saw and thought in those final months. The truth about what happened to 129 men in the worst winter of the worst years of the worst luck that the Arctic has ever visited on any expedition that dared to enter it. The ice kept the secret. The ice is keeping it still, but not perhaps for very much longer. There is a particular kind of optimism that belongs to engineers, and it is not always the same thing as wisdom. In the first half of the 19th century, the marriage of steam power and iron construction produced a generation of naval architects and naval officers who were, with very good reason, proud of what technology had made possible, and who were, with somewhat less good reason, inclined to believe that what technology had made possible was sufficient for whatever challenge the natural world might offer. The Arctic, as it so often did, proved them wrong in ways that were instructive and irreversible. The Erebus and the Terror are the most famous examples, but they were far from the only ships that went into the ice with more confidence than the ice warranted. The history of Arctic shipbuilding is in many ways a history of the same lesson being learned over and over again. The ice does not care how well your ship is built. It does not care about your reinforced bow, your steam engine, your retractable screw propeller, or the thickness of your hull planking. When the Arctic decides to crush a ship, it brings to bear forces that no wooden or iron construction of the 19th century was capable of withstanding for long, and the engineers who designed the vessels never fully understood this because they were working from the wrong mental model. They thought of the ice as a static obstacle, something to be pushed through, cut through, broken through. The ice, in reality, is a dynamic system, constantly moving and shifting and responding to currents and winds and tides, capable of exerting pressure from every direction simultaneously, and capable of changing from open water to impenetrable barrier in a matter of hours. The HMS Investigator, sent as part of the Franklin search in 1850 under Robert McClure, provides a case study in the consequences of this misunderstanding. McClure was a capable officer and a brave man, and his expedition did achieve something genuinely significant. His crew was the first to complete a transit of the Northwest Passage, though they did so partly on foot over the ice rather than by ship. But the Investigator herself spent 3 winters locked in the ice of Mercy Bay on Banks Island before McClure was finally forced to abandon her in 1853. He had tried everything: steam power, blasting with gunpowder, cutting channels by hand, and nothing had moved the ship a foot. The ice simply held her, and held her, and held her, until it became clear that she was going to be held forever. She's still there. A Parks Canada survey conducted in 2010 found her upright on the seabed of Mercy Bay, in remarkably good condition, preserved by the same cold water that had been her prison. Like the Erebus and the Terror, she waited on the bottom for the warming Arctic to make her accessible, and she is now an underwater archaeological site of considerable interest to researchers tracing the history of the Franklin. Searches. The Jeannette, an American ship sent north in 1879 under Lieutenant Commander George Washington DeLong, in pursuit of a new theory about Arctic navigation. The open polar sea idea again, in its latest incarnation, was crushed by the ice of the East Siberian Sea in June 1881 after 21 months of being carried helplessly by the drift. DeLong and his crew abandoned the ship and attempted to reach the Siberian coast in small boats, a journey that killed DeLong himself and 11 of his men from starvation and exposure before rescue parties found the survivors. The wreck of the Jeannette was never found, but pieces of her equipment and, more remarkably, an oilskin document case with papers from the expedition were discovered 3 years later on the southwestern coast of Greenland, having drifted across the Arctic Ocean on the ice. This accidental drift experiment was, as it turned out, scientifically valuable. The oceanographer Fridtjof Nansen used it as evidence to design the Fram expedition of 1893, in which he deliberately froze his specially designed ship into the ice east of the New Siberian Islands and allowed it to drift across the Arctic Ocean, surviving the experience through the application of more careful planning, and a hull designed to be lifted rather than crushed by ice pressure. Nansen's ship design, the rounded hull that would rise out of the ice rather than be gripped and squeezed by it, was a genuine engineering breakthrough, and it saved the Fram from the fate of the Jeanette and the Erebus, and the Investigator and dozens of other ships that the ice had simply killed. But it took the deaths of hundreds of men, and the loss of dozens of ships to produce the knowledge that made that design possible, and the knowledge was purchased at a price that should have been unnecessary. The whaling captains of Dundee and Peterhead had been telling the Royal Navy for decades that their ships were wrong for the ice. The Inuit had been building boats that worked with the Arctic rather than against it for 4,000 years. The lesson was available. It just had to be paid for, again and again, until finally someone was listening. The history of Arctic exploration, as it is conventionally told, is almost entirely a history of men. Men sailing ships, men hauling sledges, men planting flags and dying in the ice, and writing expedition narratives that were published to considerable acclaim and filed in the archives of geographical societies. The women in these stories appear, if they appear at all, as the people who waited at home. Jane Franklin is the great exception, partly because she could not be kept out of the story, and partly because her efforts to shape her husband's legacy were so persistent and so effective that she became, inescapably, a major character in the Arctic narrative. But the absence of women from the explicit record does not mean the absence of women from the actual history. In the communities of the Arctic, in the Norse farms of Greenland and the Inuit camps of the Canadian coast, and the Scottish whaling towns of Dundee and Peterhead, women were present, engaged, and essential to the enterprise of Arctic survival and Arctic knowledge in ways that the official record almost never acknowledges. The women of the Inuit communities were the makers of the clothing that kept Arctic travellers alive. The technology of Inuit cold weather garments, the specific combination of materials, the layering system, the methods of construction that produced garments light enough to move in and warm enough to survive in, was developed, refined, and transmitted primarily by women, and it was knowledge that the explorers who died of cold or who lost fingers and toes to frostbite because their European-made garments were inadequate were dying for lack of. Elisha Kane, who learned to take Inuit knowledge seriously, specifically credited the women who helped his crew with clothing as having materially contributed to their survival. His successors, who reverted to European methods, paid the price. The wives and sisters and mothers of the whaling captains were, in many cases, closely involved in the business of Arctic voyaging in ways that went well beyond waiting for their men to come home. The whaling industry was, in the 19th century, still largely organised on the basis of family partnerships and community investment, and the women of whaling communities were often involved in the financial management of voyages, the provisioning of ships, and the maintenance of the networks of information and credit that made the industry possible. They processed the logs and journals that came back with the ships. They maintained the correspondence that kept the community connected across enormous distances. They were, in a very real sense, part of the institutional memory of the Arctic fishing industry, even though their names appear nowhere in the official record. The recognition of these contributions is not merely a matter of historical fairness, though it is certainly that. It is also a matter of historical accuracy. The body of knowledge about the Arctic that was built up over centuries of human engagement with the far north was not built by the expedition commanders and the naval officers whose names are on the capes and the straits. It was built by everyone who was involved in the encounter, the sailors and the whalers and the indigenous hunters and their families, the women who made the clothing and preserved the knowledge and raised the children who would carry it on. The official history is a thin slice of a much richer reality, and the parts it leaves out are not incidental. They are in many cases the parts that matter most. This recognition has been coming slowly into the scholarly literature, and it is overdue. As the archaeology of the Arctic continues to develop, and as Inuit oral histories receive the serious, scholarly attention they deserve, the full picture of what it has meant to live in and with the Arctic, over millennia, across the full range of human societies that have engaged with it, is beginning to emerge. It is a picture more complex and more interesting than the old story of heroic European explorers venturing into the unknown, and it is a picture that does more justice to the actual human reality of the Arctic than anything that was produced by the age of heroic exploration. The ice does not distinguish between the famous and the forgotten. It preserves what it preserves without regard for rank or reputation, or the historical record. When the divers who entered the Erebus in recent years found personal objects in the officers' cabins, a comb, a button, a fragment of paper, they were finding the traces of individual lives, not of historical abstractions. The men who died in the ice were not symbols. They were people, with histories and families and inner lives that the historical record has largely failed to capture, and the slow work of recovering and understanding what they left behind is an act of restoration as much as it is an act of investigation. Restoring to the dead their humanity, their specificity, their reality as people rather than as characters in a national myth. This is perhaps the most important work that the modern archaeology of the Arctic is doing, and it is work that the melting ice is making possible year by year, season by season, as the frozen world opens and gives back what it has kept for so long in the dark.